Judge Michael Carter walked into courtroom for B with his usual air of routine. He'd been on the bench for nearly 2 decades, and nothing about this case looked like it would surprise him. Another theft charge, another young defendant who thought he could outsmart the law. The kind of day that would be over by lunch. The air inside the courtroom was thick, almost heavy. Wooden benches creaked as people shifted in their seats. Reporters weren't here. This wasn't the kind of trial that made headlines. The few spectators were mostly family members and curious locals who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning. At the defense table sat Ethan Walker, an 18-year-old with messy brown hair, a plain gray hoodie, and a calm expression that didn't match the seriousness of the charges against him. He didn't slouch or fidget like most defendants. Judge Carter saw. Instead, he sat straight, hands resting loosely on the table, eyes scanning the room as if he were studying it. The charges were heavy: grand theft auto and resisting arrest, enough to ruin a young man's life before it had even begun. Judge Carter glanced at the file in front of him and sighed quietly. Another kid who thinks he's smarter than the system, he thought. The prosecutor, Victoria Allen, stood near her table, shuffling papers in perfect order. She was the type who came into court prepared to win, with her dark suit pressed to perfection and her confidence sharp enough to cut. She caught the judge's eye and gave a small nod. She was ready. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. All rise. The room stood as Judge Carter took his seat. The sound of his gavel echoed once. This court is now in session. People of the state versus Ethan Walker. Ethan's name carried across the room, and for the first time, Judge Carter really looked at him. The kid didn't look scared, not even a little. That was unusual. Most 18-year-olds facing felony charges couldn't hide the panic in their eyes. Mr. Walker, Judge Carter said, flipping through the file, you understand the charges against you? Yes, Your Honor, Ethan replied, voice steady. Something about the tone, respectful but firm, made the judge pause for just a second. He shook it off. Doesn't matter, this'll be quick. Victoria Allen stepped forward, ready to make her opening statement. She gave Ethan a glance that was half challenge, half dismissal, then turned to address the jury. As she spoke, outlining the clear and undeniable evidence against the young man, Judge Carter leaned back slightly in his chair. It was all predictable. Stolen BMW SUV, eyewitness testimony from a police officer, fingerprints on the steering wheel, and a short chase before Ethan was caught. From where the judge sat, it looked like an open and shut case, the kind that ends with a guilty verdict before anyone's coffee gets cold. But in the corner of his mind, Judge Carter couldn't quite ignore something. The way Ethan was listening, not like a scared kid hearing his fate, but like someone studying every word, every detail, every move. The judge didn't know it yet, but this wouldn't be just another Tuesday. By the time the day ended, everything he thought he knew about quick cases, open and shut trials, and routine justice was about to be turned upside down. Prosecutor Victoria Allen finished her opening statement with the kind of confidence that comes from years of never losing to a public defender. She walked back to her table, set her papers down neatly, and glanced at the defense side like she had already won. Judge Michael Carter turned toward the defense. Ms. Green, he said, addressing Laura Green, Ethan's court-appointed attorney, you may proceed. Laura, a woman in her early 40s with a kind face but nervous eyes, stood and cleared her throat. Your Honor, my client. She didn't get any further. Ethan placed a calm hand on her forearm. It's okay, he said softly. Then, without asking permission, he stood up. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. The words landed in the courtroom like a dropped glass, sharp and loud, even without volume. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a low ripple of murmurs from the gallery. Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. You'll what? I'll be representing myself, Ethan repeated, his voice steady, almost casual. I'll handle my own defense. The judge let out a slow breath and sat back in his chair. Mr. Walker, this isn't a high school debate team. You're facing serious charges. You could go to prison for years. This is not the time for experiments. A few chuckles escaped from the prosecution's side of the room. Even Officer Brian Scott, sitting behind Victoria, smirked, but Ethan didn't flinch. With respect, Your Honor, I understand exactly what I'm facing, and I still choose to speak for myself. Laura Green looked torn between relief and worry. Relief, because this case was clearly going to be a nightmare to win. Worry, because she had no idea what this teenager thought he was doing. Judge Carter studied him for a long moment, tapping a pen against his file. Finally, he sighed. "Fine. The court will allow you to proceed, pro se, but don't expect any special treatment." "I wouldn't dream of it," Ethan replied, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. Victoria Allen tilted her head, crossing her arms. "Very well," she said. "Let's see what you've got." Ethan stepped forward, not rushing, not fidgeting. His sneakers made soft thuds against the polished wood floor. He reached the center of the courtroom and let a few seconds of silence hang in the air, long enough for people to start wondering if he had forgotten what to say. Then he spoke, clearly and deliberately. "Before we begin, Your Honor, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Victoria gave a small, almost amused nod. "Go ahead." "You stated that Officer Brian Scott saw me behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle before the alleged pursuit. Is that correct?" "Yes," she said confidently. "That's exactly what he stated in his report. And that report is part of the evidence against me." "It is." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then I request that testimony be removed as valid evidence." The room erupted in whispers. Judge Carter frowned. "On what grounds?" Ethan took his hands out of his hoodie pocket and gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Scott didn't see me driving that vehicle. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the pursuit began." Victoria's smile faltered. For the first time, "Excuse me, I'd like to request the GPS logs from Officer Scott's patrol car for that night." Ethan continued. "If his account is accurate, his location will match the site of the alleged chase, but I have reason to believe it won't." Now the whispers turned into a low buzz. Judge Carter shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing toward the prosecutor. "Any objection, Ms. Allen?" he asked. She hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. "No, Your Honor." And in that moment, the first crack appeared in a case that had looked rock-solid just minutes earlier. The prosecutor's hesitation still hung in the air when Judge Michael Carter turned his gaze back to Ethan. "Mr. Walker, you may proceed." Ethan gave a small nod and walked toward the jury box. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every step felt deliberate, as if he were building a rhythm that only he understood. "You've heard," he began, looking directly at the jurors, "that my fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. That's true. I'm not denying it." Victoria Allen crossed her arms, a faint smirk returning to her face. "Finally," she thought, "he admits it." "But," Ethan continued, "I want you to think about something simple. Have you ever gone shopping for clothes, tried on a jacket, slipped your hands into the pockets, maybe adjusted it in the mirror, and then put it back on the rack? Later that day, someone steals that jacket. Does that make you the thief?" The jury's eyes followed him. No one answered. They didn't have to. The analogy was clear. "That BMW," Ethan said, pointing toward an evidence photo on the screen, "was parked outside a convenience store for hours. I was there with 3 friends. We walked past it. I touched it. I leaned on it. I opened the door for a second. Stupid curiosity, I admit it. But I didn't steal it. I didn't drive it. And touching something doesn't make you a criminal." Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying him more closely now. Ethan let a pause stretch. Then he turned to the prosecutor. "Ms. Allen, you've told this court that the fingerprints prove I drove the car. Where's the forensic analyst who processed those prints?" Victoria's smirk vanished. "He's not present today." "Not present," Ethan repeated, glancing at the jury. "So the state wants to use this as their key evidence, but has decided not to bring the one person who could confirm how those prints were collected, how they were stored, and whether the process followed proper chain of custody." He walked a few steps closer to the jury, lowering his voice. "If you can't question the person who handled the evidence, can you trust it?" Victoria tightened her jaw. "Objection overruled," Judge Carter said without hesitation. Eyes still on Ethan, the teenager turned back to the jurors, his tone calm but firm. "I'm not here asking for sympathy. I'm asking for proof, real proof, not assumptions, not guesses, proof." The room had gone quieter than it had been all morning. Even Officer Brian Scott's confident posture had shifted. Ethan returned to the defense table, but before sitting, he looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, the state's case has more gaps than evidence, and those gaps matter, because in this court, people are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around. Judge Carter didn't respond right away. His fingers drummed lightly against the bench, his eyes fixed on the young man in front of him. And in that silence it was clear. The trial was no longer going the way anyone, especially the prosecution, had expected. The tension in the courtroom was now thick enough to feel. Prosecutor Victoria Allen shuffled her papers, trying to recover her rhythm. She cleared her throat and stepped forward. Regardless of how the fingerprints were processed, she said, her tone sharp again, the fact remains, the defendant's prints were inside a stolen vehicle, and he was found not far from where it was abandoned. Those facts do not change. Ethan waited until she returned to her table. Then, without rushing, he stood. Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to present an additional piece of evidence. Judge Michael Carter adjusted his glasses. What evidence? A sworn statement from the actual owner of the BMW, Mr. Mark Thompson. Victoria froze mid-knot. Ethan held up a single-page affidavit. In his original statement to the police, Mr. Thompson said this: I left my car running while I went into the store. When I came back, it was gone. I saw the person who took it. He was white. The words hit the room like a punch. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Ethan turned toward the jury, his voice steady. Now, I'm not white, and yet here I am, facing charges for a crime committed by someone who clearly doesn't match my description. This statement is in the original police report. The prosecution had it. The arresting officer had it. But you didn't hear about it until now. Victoria quickly stood. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Irrelevant. Ethan's voice was still calm, but it carried weight. A witness describing the real suspect is irrelevant. Judge Carter's gaze shifted to the prosecutor, Ms. Allen. She hesitated, her lips pressed in a thin line. The defendant was found near the vehicle. Ethan cut in, not raising his voice. I was found walking home with friends, carrying sodas from the store we'd just left. I wasn't fleeing. I wasn't in the car, and there is zero proof otherwise. The jury's expressions had shifted. Some looked skeptical of the prosecution. Others were clearly leaning in Ethan's direction. He stepped closer to them, lowering his tone like he was letting them in on a secret. The truth is simple. The real suspect got away that night, but the police saw me, a young guy in the wrong neighborhood, with the wrong face, and decided I was good enough to arrest. That's not justice. That's convenience. Victoria sat down, flipping through her notes with an urgency that betrayed her frustration. Ethan walked back to his table, but not before glancing at Judge Carter. Your Honor, this trial isn't about proof anymore. It's about a rush to judgment. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time that morning, he looked unsettled, and deep down, he knew why. Because this young man might be right. The air in Courtroom for B felt different now. It wasn't just tension anymore, it was doubt. And doubt, Ethan knew, was the one thing that could unravel an airtight case. Judge Michael Carter shifted in his seat, flipping through the file again as if trying to confirm what he had just heard. That statement from Mark Thompson, the car's owner, wasn't just a small detail. It was the kind of thing that should have been front and center from the very beginning. Ethan stood again, his movements slow but deliberate. Your Honor, he began, before the prosecution continues, I want to address something important, not just for me, but for every person who comes through these doors. He walked to the center of the room, hands clasped loosely in front of him. We all want to believe the system is fair, that everyone who sits in this chair is judged by evidence, not by assumptions. But when you look closely at this case, he paused, scanning the jury. It's not built on solid facts, it's built on shortcuts. Victoria Allen rose, halfway from her chair. Objection overruled, Judge Carter said, without even looking at her. Ethan continued. First, the prosecution relied on testimony from an officer who wasn't even on duty at the start of the chase. Then, they presented fingerprint evidence without the forensic analyst here to explain how it was handled. And now, we've seen that the victim himself described someone else entirely, a detail that never made it into their presentation to you. He turned to the jurors, his voice lowering but growing more intense. If I were guilty, why would they need to leave out pieces of the story? Why hide the full picture? The jury was silent. Even the bailiff, who had been leaning casually against the wall, now stood straighter. Ethan walked back toward his table, but halfway there, he stopped and faced the judge directly. Your Honor, if the state can take a young man like me, erase the details that don't fit their theory, and still expect a conviction, Then it's not just my freedom on trial here. It's the credibility of this courtroom. Judge Carter's eyes narrowed, studying him. The judge had seen countless defendants make emotional pleas, but this wasn't desperation. This was control, precision. Victoria shuffled her papers again, but the crisp confidence she had when the trial began was gone. She spoke quickly, trying to regain the floor. Regardless of the defendant's interpretation, the facts remain. No, Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but unshakable. The facts don't remain. The facts have been challenged. And unless the prosecution can fill in those holes with something real, all they have left are assumptions. It was a bold move, one that left the room in absolute stillness. Judge Carter leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. He didn't say it out loud, but the thought flickered across his mind. Maybe this case isn't as simple as I thought. Prosecutor Victoria Allen straightened her posture, her voice sharper now. Your Honor, the defense is twisting the narrative. The defendant was found near the stolen vehicle minutes after it was abandoned. That alone is suspicious enough too. Ethan didn't wait for her to finish. Suspicion isn't proof, he said firmly, turning toward the jury. If suspicion was enough to convict, then anyone in the wrong place at the wrong time could end up in this chair. Victoria clenched her jaw. The defendant's prints were on the steering wheel, and yet, Ethan cut in again, you have no forensic expert here to confirm the process. No chain of custody records presented, and you have ignored, completely ignored, the fact that the vehicle's owner identified someone who looks nothing like me. Judge Michael Carter lifted a hand toward the prosecution. Ms. Allen, can you explain why that portion of the owner's statement was omitted from your opening presentation? Her pause was all the answer the jury needed. It wasn't relevant to our theory of the case, Your Honor. A wave of murmurs rolled through the gallery. Ethan took a step closer to the jurors. Exactly, their theory, not the truth. And when evidence doesn't fit their theory, they set it aside and hope no one notices. He let that sit for a moment before continuing. But I noticed, and I'm asking you to notice, too. Because today it's me. Tomorrow it could be someone you know, your friend, your brother, your son, sitting here while details that could prove their innocence are left out. Because they don't match a story someone wants to tell. The jury's expressions had shifted again. Some were leaning forward, as if trying to catch every word. Ethan then faced the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to strike the fingerprint evidence from the record, on the grounds that the prosecution failed to produce the expert who processed it, violating my right to cross-examination. Judge Carter didn't answer immediately. He glanced toward the prosecution. Response. Victoria hesitated. Your Honor, the expert was unavailable. That's not the defense's problem, the judge interrupted. And frankly, I find it troubling that such critical evidence wasn't accompanied by its primary witness. Ethan stood quietly, but inside, he knew the balance of the trial had shifted. Finally, Judge Carter nodded. Motion granted. The fingerprint evidence is stricken from the record. The gallery erupted in a wave of whispers. For the first time, Ethan saw the flash of panic in Victoria Allen's eyes. One of her strongest pillars of proof had just been ripped away, and she knew it. Ethan returned to his seat slowly, deliberately. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just looked at the jury, as if to silently say, this is what happens when the truth is actually tested. The courtroom was still buzzing from Judge Michael Carter's decision to strike the fingerprint evidence. Prosecutor Victoria Allen shuffled her papers again, but the neat, calculated rhythm she had earlier was gone. She was stalling, and everyone knew it. Ethan leaned back in his chair for a moment, letting the tension breathe. Then he stood up, slowly, and stepped toward the center of the courtroom. His voice was calm, but there was a precision to every word. Your Honor, he began, since one of the prosecution's key pieces of evidence has been removed, I'd like to address another, the testimony from Officer Brian Scott. Victoria's shoulders stiffened. Ethan turned to the jury. You were told Officer Scott saw me behind the wheel of the stolen BMW before the chase began, but I've requested the GPS logs from his patrol car for that night. Those logs are now in evidence. Judge Carter gestured toward the clerk. Proceed. Ethan walked over to a monitor set up for exhibits. According to these logs, at the exact time the alleged sighting occurred, Officer Scott's vehicle was parked. Here, he pointed to a highlighted spot on the map, which, for the record, is over 3 miles away from where the BMW was. First spotted, the jury shifted in their seats. That means, Ethan continued, He couldn't possibly have seen me driving it. Not unless he has extra vision and can see through buildings from miles away. A faint chuckle escaped from somewhere in the gallery. Even Judge Carter had to hide a small smirk behind his hand. Ethan pressed on. This is the second time we've seen something critical, something the prosecution leaned on heavily, fall apart when it's actually examined. And yet, I'm supposed to trust that every other detail they've given you is flawless. Victoria quickly rose to object. Your Honor, this line of questioning overruled, Carter said, his tone now carrying a hint of curiosity. I'd like to hear where this is going. Ethan nodded in thanks and turned back to the jury. Here's the truth. The case against me wasn't built carefully. It was built quickly, because once they had a young man standing in the wrong area at the wrong time, they stopped looking. They stopped asking questions. And when you stop asking questions, innocent people get charged for things they didn't do. The silence after his words wasn't empty. It was heavy. The kind of silence where you could feel opinions shifting. Victoria sat back down, her jaw tight. The confident prosecutor from the morning was gone. Now she was a chess player running out of pieces, and Ethan, he wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was dismantling the very foundation of the case, brick by brick, in front of everyone. By now, the atmosphere in courtroom for B had shifted entirely. The morning had started with quiet confidence on the prosecution's side, but now all eyes and all weight were on Ethan Walker. Judge Michael Carter leaned forward slightly, elbows on the bench, as if unwilling to miss a single word. The jury, too, was locked in. Even the bailiff had stopped scanning the room and was watching. Ethan, like this was the most important trial of the year. Ethan took a step closer to the jury box, his voice lower but sharper, each word landing like a hammer. The prosecution wants you to believe this is an open and shut case. They want you to think that fingerprints on a steering wheel, a sighting from an officer miles away, and me being near an abandoned car is enough to take away years of my life. He paused, scanning the faces in front of him. But what we've actually seen is something else entirely. Missing witnesses, altered narratives, and evidence that collapses under the slightest pressure. Prosecutor Victoria Allen stood. Suddenly, Your Honor, the defense is making this personal. It is personal, Ethan interrupted, still looking at the jury. Because when shortcuts are taken, when details are ignored, it's not the prosecutor or the police who pay the price, it's the person sitting in this chair. He gestured toward himself. And if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. He let the weight of that linger. The room was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was full of tension, of shifting thoughts, of the slow realization that maybe, just maybe, this case wasn't what it seemed. Ethan then turned toward Judge Carter. Your Honor, this isn't about whether the prosecution believes I'm guilty. It's about whether they can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And after everything we've seen, can anyone in this courtroom honestly say they still have no doubt? Victoria Allen opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, settling back into her chair. Her fingers tapped anxiously on the table. Ethan returned his gaze to the jury one last time. The law says I'm innocent until proven guilty, not suspicious until proven innocent. If we forget that, if we let fear or convenience replace proof, then this isn't justice. It's just punishment without cause. Judge Carter exhaled, leaning back. His expression was unreadable, but the crease between his brows had deepened. The balance of the trial had shifted so completely that the only question now was whether the prosecution had anything left to fight with, and Ethan knew the answer. They didn't. Prosecutor Victoria Allen wasn't ready to walk away without a fight. Her pride and her record wouldn't let her. She stood quickly, her voice sharper than it had been all day. Your Honor, regardless of the defense's theatrics, the defendant was still located dangerously close to the stolen vehicle. That is not a coincidence. Ethan didn't move from where he stood, but his head tilted slightly, almost as if he pitied the argument. With respect, Ms. Allen, being near something isn't a crime. If it were, then everyone who walked past that BMW that night would be on trial right now. Victoria pressed on. He admits to touching the car. He admits to opening the door. Yes, Ethan interrupted smoothly. I admitted it because I'm not hiding anything. And you know why I can admit it. Because touching something isn't theft. Because curiosity isn't a felony. Because the law doesn't punish stupidity with prison time. At least it's not supposed to. A ripple of faint laughter broke out in the gallery. Judge Michael Carter didn't smile, but it didn't call for silence either. Victoria's voice grew tighter. "Your Honor, the state still maintains." Ethan took a step forward, his tone dropping into something colder, sharper. "The state maintains what? A theory built on missing evidence, false testimony, and a description that doesn't even match me. You've had every chance to prove your case, Miss Allen, and every time I've pulled back the curtain, there's been nothing there." The courtroom was silent again, except for the quiet scratching of the court reporter's keys. Ethan turned toward the jury for what was clearly his final address. "I'm not asking you to like me. I'm not asking you to approve of my choices. I'm asking you to look at the facts, the real facts. When you remove the assumptions, what's left? A teenager who touched a car he didn't own. That's it. That's your case." He glanced back at the judge. "Your Honor, the state has failed to meet the burden of proof. And in this country, that means one thing." He let the pause hang, then finished quietly but firmly, "Not guilty." Victoria Allen sat down slowly, her eyes on the table, the fight gone from her shoulders. She knew she had nothing left to offer. Judge Carter looked between the prosecution and the defense, his lips pressed together in thought. Finally, he closed the file in front of him and set it aside. "This court will now render its decision." The air tightened. Every eye in the room turned to the bench. Judge Michael Carter looked down at his notes for a long moment. Though it was clear his mind was no longer on the papers, when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight. The courtroom hadn't heard from him all day. "I've been on this bench for many years," he began, scanning the room slowly, "and I've seen more cases than I can count. Some are strong, some are weak, but I can't recall the last time I saw a defendant dismantle a case piece by piece the way Mr. Walker has today." He turned his gaze directly on Ethan. 18 years old, no formal training in law, and yet you've raised valid, serious concerns about the prosecution's evidence, or lack of it. And this court cannot, in good conscience, ignore that. Victoria Allen kept her eyes fixed on her desk, her pen motionless in her hand. Judge Carter's voice grew firm. "The testimony of Officer Scott is unreliable. The fingerprint evidence has been stricken. The owner's statement points to another suspect entirely. What remains is insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." He paused, letting the words settle before delivering the final blow. "Therefore, the charges against Ethan Walker are hereby dismissed." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Then a wave of murmurs and gasps rippled through the room. A few people in the gallery even clapped quietly before being hushed. Ethan stood still, his face calm, but inside, he felt the rush of oxygen flooding back into his lungs. He glanced over to the defense table, where Laura Green, the attorney he'd replaced, gave him a small, proud smile. From the corner of his eye, he saw his mother, Susan Walker, standing at the back of the courtroom. Her eyes glistened, but she kept her chin high, the way she had taught him to face the world. When the bailiff announced court was adjourned, she rushed forward and wrapped her arms around him. "You scared me half to death," she whispered against his ear. "I know," Ethan murmured back, a faint smile forming. "But I had to try." As they walked toward the exit, flashes from cameras exploded outside the doors. Reporters shouted questions. "How did you pull it off? Did you know you'd win? What's next for you?" But Ethan kept his head down. This had never been about fame. It had been about proving the truth. On the courthouse steps, Susan squeezed his hand. "So, what is next for you?" Ethan looked out at the crowd, then up at the towering courthouse behind him. "Next time I'm in one of these courtrooms," he said, "I'm not going to be the one sitting at the defense table." Susan smiled through her tears. "You mean?" "I'm going to law school," Ethan said, simply, "and I'm going to make sure no one else has to go through what I did alone." Behind them, Judge Carter emerged from the courthouse. He caught Ethan's eye for just a moment and gave a small nod, not as a judge to a defendant, but as one man to another, with mutual respect. And as Ethan walked away from the building, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much bigger, a fight for justice that had only just begun.